I'll be speaking with Nandita Sharma. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Hawaii. She is of Indian background, and that'll be important for what we'll be talking about today. She's speaking to us from Honolulu, Hawaii, and we'll be talking about the Prime Minister of India's visit to Washington tomorrow. Good morning.
Morning, Stanley. Nice to be here with you.
Now, in our corporate media, we see endless talk about democracy in India, how it's the biggest democracy in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But Modi has been accused of taking India down a different road, an authoritarian, and some even call it a fascist path. What do you think of that criticism?
I think that criticism is spot on. I'm very concerned about the growing authoritarianism in India, the growing threats to minorities in India, the growing use of violence by the Indian state against people who are its critics, as well as people that it defines as enemies of the people, right? And we know historically that when a state starts defining certain people as its enemies, it sets them up for the supposedly legitimate use of the state's violence. And that's precisely what we're seeing in India. So it's very, very concerning that someone like Modi, who has been very clearly indicated as, fomenting a lot of violence, and now is that, enacting the violence of the Indian state being welcomed in the United States.
Maybe we could talk about a couple specific examples. A couple of years ago, Time magazine had a terrifying article about lynchings, basically, in India, where mobs or gangs would take people, Muslims, and demand they recite some kind of Hindu testament of faith, I think, something about Lord Ram. Is that still going on, or is that a major thing?
No, absolutely. And those kinds of what Hindu nationalists, or we could also call them Hindu fascists, refer to as conversion programs, right? Or even they actually call them reconversion programs, because they believe that the true religion of everyone in India today is actually Hinduism, and that some people converted away from it, so they need to be reconverted back into Hinduism, right? Which is a fundamental lack of respect for people's freedom to choose their religion, or to choose to not be religious, right? This idea that to be a proper citizen of the Indian nation state, you must be a Hindu, goes right to the very top. So it's not just these, mobs who are engaged in that kind of violence against non-Hindus. It's Modi himself, right? Modi himself, for example, in 2015, went to started labeling Muslims in India as illegal migrants, right? And he promised in 2015 to, quote unquote, return them to Bangladesh, right? Bangladesh is a Muslim majority state. And so referring to them as Bangladeshis was a clear, that they should return to Bangladesh was a clear kind of anti-Muslim signal. But he actually promised in his 2015 speeches to return, quote unquote, illegal Muslim migrants to Bangladesh unless they, quote unquote, reconverted back to Hinduism, right? So these kinds of mob lynchings are being condoned by Modi himself at the very highest levels of the Indian state.
Now, Modi's basic politics is something called Hindutva. Can you explain what that is?
So Hindutva has been a force in politics in India even before there was an Indian nation state, right? It's been a part of the politics in the subcontinent since the 1920s, as India, as what we now call India, was fighting British imperialism. So from the 1920s on, there was one segment of nationalist movements in India that argued that the nation that they were fighting to liberate was a Hindu nation, right? And so Modi, the organizations that he's belonged to since he was a child, were part of that kind of political trajectory in nationalist politics in India. Now that kind of Hindu nationalism started becoming an electoral force in government in India starting in the 1980s. And with the election of Modi as prime minister in 2014, that the rise of Hindu nationalism was cemented and they took over the Indian nation state itself, right? So Hindutva is a political philosophy that argues that the nation state of India is is defined by its Hinduism. And so if you're not Hindu, you're a threat to the nation state, right? So this is the basis of much of the violence that's being targeted, particularly at Muslims, but increasingly against Christians. And of course, no one is safe, right? Whether they're Sikh or Parsi or any other religion in India, no one is safe unless they abide by this kind of Hindutva philosophy.
And what about the question of caste? What does Hindutva think about that, particularly the treatment of the lower caste, the Dalits?
Well, Hindutva is very much about valorizing Hinduism, right? And Hinduism for a very long time now has as its fundamental principle casteism, right? The idea that your proper place within society has been determined by the caste that you are born into, right? So caste is not something that you can change. It's an inherited status that carries on for generation after generation, right? So the Modi's philosophy, and certainly the philosophy of Hindutva, is an quote unquote upper caste philosophy, right? It's a form of Hinduism that is dominated by the upper castes in that kind of caste system. So even though its ultimate kind of basis for violence is Hindu versus non-Hindu, Hindutva and the BJP that Modi leads and Modi's governing philosophy also targets many other Hindus, right? Working class Hindus, Hindus of quote unquote lower castes, and particularly Dalits, right? The quote unquote people who are, so outside of, Hindu society that they are casteless, right? That they're not even worthy of being, allowed into the caste system. So the violence that Hindutva does to Muslims, to Christians, is targeted also at people that the upper castes also believe are inferior to them.
And this leader of Hindutva is going to be honored with the rare honor of speaking to both houses of Congress and have a state dinner with the president. Incredible. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think that it's clear that what the United States is doing is trying to enfold India into its kind of geopolitical machinations, right? To try and get India on side, particularly against China, right? Against the growing influence and geopolitical power and economic clout of China. So what we're I think that what we also need to pay attention to as Modi is welcomed into the United States by the US president is that this world that we live in, this world of nation states, is a very dangerous world for most of us, right? What we're seeing in India with Hindutva, right? This defining and narrowing of the definition of who belongs in any given nation state, right? For Hindu fascists, you have to be Hindu, and particularly if you're upper caste Hindus, you're going to wield violent power against others. But that's this kind of nationalism that we see in India, this rise of fascism that we see in India and its entrenchment is happening across the world, right? It's happening in France, right? Which is also defining itself against Muslims, right? It's happening in the United States. We see a very popular, significant number of people in the US defining themselves as white nationalists, right? So we're seeing this across the world. And I think it's something that all of us need to pay attention to, that nationalism of whatever stripe and whoever carries it out, and the power of the state in its kind of national guise tends towards fascism. And we need to acknowledge that if we have any hope of addressing it either in India, in the United States, or anywhere else on the planet.
I read some of your article on the Spectre site about how anti-colonial struggles against empires in Africa and Asia have not really been liberating, but have gone down the narrow chauvinistic nationalist path. Maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, it's very troubling. You know, my own grandparents were part of the Indian nationalist movement against the British Empire, right? But the dreams that my grandparents had of liberation, and they imagined it as a national liberation, right? Those dreams have never been honored and realized. And those dreams of national liberation have not been honored or realized anywhere on this planet, right? So I think that it's time for us to decouple our ideas of decolonization or liberation from nationalism, because what we're seeing, whether it's in the former colonies in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and of course, in the heart of the empires in Europe, we're seeing a hardening of nationalisms. And they're hardening around this idea of there's one group of people that are the real nationals, and then there's everybody else. And the violence that we do to everyone else is perfectly legitimate, right? So I think that understanding this, the rise of Hindu fascism in India as a global process that's deeply embedded in nationalism is something that we need to tackle, head on.
Are there parties in India or intellectuals who have that understanding, to your knowledge?
I'm probably not the right person to ask that question to, because I'm not very familiar with the politics, the day-to-day on the ground politics in India today. But I would say that if it's anything like the United States, right? And I'm sure there's major differences. I'm not trying to equate the two. But if it's anything like the United States or most other places in the world, most people are nationalist, right? Like the answers that they have to any problems is, again, we need a different party in power. We need a different party that rules the nation state, right? They're not, the party in power today is not really representing the true values and beliefs of our nation, right? So even on the left, as well as on the right, particularly the far right, we have this kind of nationalism that is kind of unquestioned, unchallenged, and even romanticized and valued, right? So I think that there are a growing number of people that are concerned by that. And in my circles, those are generally people who are working with the targets of nationalist violence, right? Whether they've been classified as migrants or they've been classified as threats to national security or members of foreign religions, or, you know, whatever label they are given. The kind of outsiders to the nation, I think, are the people that we can turn to because they realize probably better than the rest of us the violence that nationalism does.
And maybe we should dust off that old word internationalist and really live up to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, right? That the national liberation movements against imperialism were not the only movements that fought colonialism, right? There were many, many other kinds of movements that had different visions of the world than carving it up into different nation states, right? With their own separate sovereigns. And I think we can look back to those movements, the internationalisms that you were talking about, the different world views that people had prior to the rise of nationalism as a source of inspiration today.
Well, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you, Stanley.